Welcome to Africa Update this week. Of course, it's a beautiful season. It's a Yuletide season. And of course, it's the end of the year as well. A lot of people are doing reviews, introspections, 2025 in view and all that, photo dumps on social media. And right here on the program, we're not going to be left out. We're going to be doing, or continuing rather, our reviews. Last week, we did a review on the African continent. But this week, we're just honing in one direction, and that's the economy. To stay with us, the program continues. Welcome back to Africa Update. I'm your host, Chiamaka Nwafor. As I said before that break, we're going to look at the economy. Yes, we're going to be having a look at Africa's economy in 2025. How well did we fare? Now, let's give a brief introduction to the program, and then I'll introduce my guest, who is not a stranger to the Trust TV family, but is going to be a first-timer here on the Africa Update scene. So now let's get to the conversation at hand. African economy in 2025 was defined by slow recovery, high vulnerability, and cautious reforms. While some countries posted growth driven by commodities, services, and digital sectors, the overall picture was shaped by debt stress, inflation, currency weakness, climate shocks, and rising unemployment, especially among youth. And we can see that with the protests that took place in Kenya, mostly talking about, cost of living. Now, one of those things that happened is growth, uneven and fragile. Economic growth across Africa remained uneven, with oil and mineral exporting countries performing better than import-dependent economies. East Africa, notably Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, showed relative resilience, supported by services, agriculture, and infrastructure spending. West Africa faced a mixed outcome. Nigeria especially struggled with inflation, FX volatility, and subsidy reforms. Ghana focused on debt restructuring and fiscal consolidation, while conflict-affected countries like Sudan, parts of the DRC, Sahel states saw stagnation or contraction. Now, key issues is that the growth did not translate into broad-based job creation. Of course, the major issue that we have on the continent is debt. And that was one of the major points of the first G20 summit on the continent. Even, in all conversations that it's been hard with the international community, how can we reduce the debt burden of the African continent? Now, public debt remained one of Africa's most critical challenges in 2025. Several countries spent a large share of revenue on debt servicing, limiting investment in health, education, and infrastructure. Debt restructuring efforts continued in Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia. At the G20 Johannesburg summit, African leaders pushed for debt relief and restructuring, reform of the global financial architecture, more concessional financing. Now, of course, key issues were that debt sustainability versus development needs. Now, inflation was something that we saw again across the continent. However, in Nigeria, for the past 6 to 7 months or so, we've been seeing a disinflation. Equally over in Ghana, the numbers are coming down, and that's what's happening in some parts of the country. But that's not the case for the whole continent, as inflation remained high across much of the continent, driven by food and fuel prices, currency depreciation, import dependence. Currency weakness hit countries like Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Angola, raising import costs. Now, cost of living pressures sparked protests and labor unrest in several countries, again, Kenya being that focal point. And energy infrastructure and industrial policy, energy shortages continue to constrain productivity. Major discussions at the Africa Energy Forum focused on power generation and transmission, energy transition versus energy access, private sector investment. Of course, technology, AI, and digital economy. Africa accelerated engagement with digital transformation. AI, fintech, e-commerce, and mobile services expanded, actually. Kigali's Global AI Summit symbolized ambitions to leapfrog traditional development paths. digital sectors created opportunities but remained constrained by skills gaps, power shortages, limited access to capital, and of course trade, investment and global positioning. African countries continue to push for deeper regional integration through the AFCFTA through implementation lag, though the implementation lagged actually. Now, foreign investment was selective, focused on critical minerals, energy, infrastructure. Global geopolitical competition increased Africa's strategic importance, but did not always translate into better trade terms. Now, you know that we've had a lot of these other countries in the West and in the East make a play for Africa. We see a lot of people trying to put themselves there, the US, Russia, China, trying to make a play, even France to a certain extent, trying to make a play for the minerals and resources. But somehow this hasn't translated greatly for the betterment of the economy of Africa. Now, I'm not the person who's going to be speaking to us today. I'm just trying to give us an introduction. Joining me virtually from Kano State is Dr. Emmanuel Bashayi. He's one of our staples on the business program on Trust TV, but today he's joined us for the first time here on Africa Update to help us see how well the African continent has fared economically in 2025. Good afternoon.
Hi, Chiamaka. Good afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to Africa Update. It's a different way things are being done here. So welcome to Africa Update, actually.
Thank you, Chiamaka. It's a pleasure being here.
Okay, so tell us basically, what do you think of the economy of Africa in 2025? Do you think we've done better? Do you think we've done worse? You know, especially let's compare with 2024 and 2025.
Well, so in 2025, Africa will be basically classified or categorized as a two continent. So we have major economies like Nigeria and Ethiopia navigating some very severe currency and debt restructuring challenges. And over 40% of the African nations are growing at 5% growth rate, nearly double the global average of about 2.5, right? So it's a mixed pudding. The focus has for 2025 for Africa has been more around operational resilience and in the intracontinental supply chain issues. So looking at it holistically from macroeconomic performance, we've seen real average real GDP of the continent projected at 4.2%, which is outpacing the global average about 3.2, which is very good. We had high performance. We had high performers. We had some giant reversals, and then we had some countries that served as stabilizers for the economy in Africa. So the high performance are majorly the East African guys, the East African trio, if you want to call them, led by Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya, growing at about 7.5, and 5.4% respectively. So this was a good one for Africa. But then within the African bloc, we had Senegal. Clearly standing out within the bloc, growing about 9.3% in GDP, leveraging its offshore assets and then the global the gas that it has embarked on, and so on and so forth. So it was a mixed thing. So when you look at the giant reversals, Nigeria and Ethiopia have been a very classical case where you have a very dramatic GDP contractions, especially in USD terms. The cost to operate in dollar terms is relatively lower but higher in local currency. So it's good to see a lower dollar number, but then in the local currency is still pretty very high. Then it also created a window for export-oriented manufacturing kind of. But then the good thing is that we have stabilizers within the year. South Africa was clearly the best reform stabilizer, having a reform bounce of 1.5%, driven by the stability in their power grid, which they had some challenges with from 2022 up to 2024. So there's been a lot of stabilization in their power grid, and this was significantly facilitated their unity, government of national unity. So this is Africa in terms of the macroeconomics sense, the other issues around the country-specific indices around all that played out within the year. So
Okay.
yeah, very eventful year, but then Africa is a very exciting place to look.
Okay. Let's talk about something quite important that took place this year. It's something that took place outside the country, affected the most of the world, and I like to call it the Trump tornado, the tariffs by President Donald Trump. How well do you think it impacted Africa? You know, we see some countries that most of their exports were going to America. I think Lesotho, for one, most of his citrus or apples, I believe, were going to America. But due to those imports, they had some certain issues. How were drastically impacted was Africa by the Trump tariff that was swept through the world?
So it's I mean, a case where you're impacted in one way, you seek to see how you can also leverage how your actions can impact the country, I mean, America on the other hand. So there was a lot of reciprocity in terms of those kind of tariffs. So if you treat me this way, on this side, I'll also reciprocate on the other side, because you also depend on me for certain things. So I think certain countries have also found alternatives to how they export, where they export their products to outside of the US, and those that have the bargaining power in terms of having a product that also significantly sought after in the US, we saw those countries also increasing tariffs also for products that for products that the US want to source from them, and so on and so forth. But Africa was not significantly impacted because I think the volume of trade is usually commodity based. So it's maybe one country, it's a country commodity specific combination, such that it might not be everything that you export that go into the US. Some other exports to other countries, and then there are varying degrees of contribution in terms of what you export out, in terms of which country gets the highest percentage of which you export. So I think if you discount that, I wouldn't see that impacting a lot of African economies, because I think there was a lot of resilience on our part to be able to navigate some of those wars quickly, and then those that had the comparative advantage were able to leverage that quickly as possible as well.
Now, one of the other things that happened in the economy, rather in the continent, were things like protests. I want to take Kenya and Nigeria had its own protests, and they were all mostly about economy. And one of the things that we keep talking about is the fact that there's so much youth unemployment. Now, we've said there's so much good things that have happened in the continent. How come that this hasn't translated into solving the unemployment situation of the African continent?
So, when citizens put leaders in power, they seek to get good governance at the end of the day. So we saw a lot of protests in Kenya. Of course, anytime there is a protest, there's going to be an impact on the economy in terms of productivity, man hours being lost, and businesses are impacted, even the economy is impacted in one way or the other. So we look at it in terms of how these economies or the governments are able to manage their internal issues and not crisis to result in the fewest levels of disruptions possible. Key thing is the case of Kenya. While the protests were quite prolonged and they were quite here and there, the key thing was that when the protests subsided, they moved in very quickly to cover up the lost grounds. And if you notice, Kenya was still among the countries that had a significant contribution to the growth in East African bloc, especially. Despite their fiscal consolidation and some of the IF related reforms, they have maintained a steady growth of about 5.2%. Yeah, I mean, they've moved pivotally shifted from government-led infrastructure to private sector-led digital services. So they kind of found a way to recover as quickly as possible from the losses that the protests will have brought in terms of manpower and the other disruptions that will have come as a result of the protests. So yes, disruption can happen, but I think the case of Kenya was that of resilience from the country, I mean, from the leaders of the country and the managers of the economy to be able to quickly found a rebound in spite of the drop or in spite of the uncertainties that they, I mean, in spite of the disruptions that they had.
Okay. All right. We're going to go on a short break, and when we return, the conversation continues on Africa Update. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Africa Update here on Trust TV. Now we're talking about the economy of Africa. How have we fared this week? It's about this is the period of introspection, and we're not being left out. We're watching and reviewing the economy of Africa in 2025, and we're being joined virtually by Dr. Emmanuel Bashayi, an economic and business consultant. Now, Doctor, back to our conversation. One of the other key issues that we saw, or that I understand, at least here in West Africa, there was disinflation. Nigeria has experienced disinflation overtly for the past 6 to 8 months, if I believe. Ghana, too, on its end, has seen disinflation. Their numbers are actually down below 10 digits. However, it seems inflation is still very, very high on the continent. What do you make of that? And what do you think the central bank of these countries are doing to help bring these numbers down and push Africa forward?
So, of course, every country in the world grapples with inflation. So it's not just limited to Africa or Nigeria, as the case may be. So, good thing is we saw the Nigerian inflation numbers coming down consistently in the last couple of months. As at the November update, it's about 14.45%, right? So steady decrease in the inflation number, especially driven by core inflation, which has a lot of correlation with the FX and all of that. But then I think what's key is that while the continent is dealing with all the inflations, and some of them are country specific factors, there are three key elements that every country needs to be able to be able to put together the right strategies to be able to ensure that they're able to navigate through this. The first is currency volatility. This Nigeria has been very much hit by this. I think countries like Egypt and Ethiopia were also significantly impacted. What is key is to be able to shift to localization. Those countries need to do their best to source raw materials locally to avoid FX denominated costs in terms of raw materials. You can buy machinery and so on and so forth, but these are actually one-off costs. But costs that are like current costs that materials that need more consistently consumable, you should be able to find a way of localizing those so that you don't depend a lot on FX imported products where you will need FX to be able to source. The second point is around the debt distress. in some of the repayments, interest repayments consume close to 27% of some of the government's revenues from countries in Africa. So what is key for these countries is to be able to explore opportunities and the PPP, public-private sector partnerships, where there will be injection of private sector funds into building infrastructure, creating the right long-term solution for perennial problems in terms of infrastructure. So these are the things that countries need to do that. And then thirdly, and most importantly, is that energy gap, where in some countries, Nigeria is also significantly impacted by this, constant outages of the national grid, people having to resort to alternative sources of energy. Right now in Nigeria, having solar system or an off-grid system of power generation is no longer a luxury. It's basically a core part of your business. So businesses will have to evolve and come up to terms with the fact that these realities are here to us. This inflation will need to take deliberate effort to be able to curb it. In Nigeria, the CBN has continued to increase the MPR consistently until what point that they felt like it was beginning to use, and then they started doubling down. They started cutting down on the rates and all. So different countries will have to evolve strategies to combat both inflation and also guarantee the growth of the economy. Overall, we have a nation to build, and we also have inflation to keep under control. But most importantly is that the volatility needs to be put in check, local currencies need to stabilize, debt countries' indebtedness needs to be put under check, and then energy availability, and then the gap between what the public energy supply is and what private energy needs to be narrowed down as much as possible, so that we can take care of most of the things and really create the tension in the system and create a level of inflation that has been difficult for some countries to tame, and so on and so on.
Okay, so you mentioned debt earlier, and I have a very important question, which is, do you think that Africa has reached its limit for debt finance development?
So the answer is yes and no. I think this will be more country specific.
Okay.
When we talk debt to GDP ratio, that is usually what the fancy catch that the government economists will tell you, oh, debt to GDP ratio is still good, they can still borrow more and all. Now, borrowing itself is not bad. It's what you use the borrowing for that becomes the problem. You cannot borrow funds to take care of current expenditure, for example. You should also locally how you raise the money to pay your salaries and all of the daily expenditure. You use loans to pay for infrastructure. So a loan that you need to pay in 30 years, you can take the money today, build the infrastructure, so that for the next 30 years you're enjoying the infrastructure while you're paying the loan. So it is that case of having the fiscal discipline to take loans, to invest in very critical sectors that have direct impact on the lives of people, especially in infrastructure that is visibly the impact of that infrastructure can be visibly felt by the police. So there are some countries that should seek not to take any further loans, because when the terms are no longer favorable, and then it's cutting, the interest rates are cutting deep into revenues. I think the key recommendation the last couple of months has, don't look at debt to GDP, look at debt revenue. So revenue should be more of the factor to consider rather than GDP. Remember, GDP for the most part of this estimate, but revenue is a rating. Okay. So when you look at what you need to be paying back versus what you are borrowing, or you already have as borrowed equity, you will now need to take very, very proactive steps to ensure that you don't become heavily in debt and you become unable to pay off your debt, and then it creates another round of crisis for the economy and so forth.
Okay, so in less than 30 seconds, maximum 30 seconds, because that's the time we have left, what single policy shift would most improve Africa's economic outlook in 2026?
The most important policy shift will be around the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, free trade. It's one single vehicle that can significantly push the frontiers for growth within the African continent. Because the truth there is that we're a large family, and we need to first of all look at within ourselves how we're able to support each other before we think about how we can collaborate with external forces beyond the shores of Africa. The good thing there is that 2025 marks 5 years of the start of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's a very solid initiative, and the funny part of it is that Africa has remained majorly people in silos. We need to integrate. We need to be able to expand this initiative from the current 30 plus to over 30 countries, allowing businesses to trade very easily. Let's have the CAPS system work, the Pan-African Men's Settlement System, where when we have to pay for intracontinental import, we should be able to have a men's system that allows countries to pay in their local currencies rather than having to depend on the scarce eggs or scarce US dollars that will also further put more pressure on our economies. So this is a key game changer for Africa. While other countries are making their own efforts, this is going to be a collective vehicle that enables Africa to grow together, leveraging our different strengths and having a synergistic mix of our energies to get a better result than the individual acts working in silos.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Bashayi, for giving us your insights on how Africa has fared economically in 2025 and an outlook for us in 2026.
The pleasure is always mine, Chiamaka.
And that's it for Africa Update this week. I hope you've heard how far we've done, and most importantly, what we could do to make R26 better. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, a very, very major instrument that the continent can use to help us become the real giants, of the world that we are. And that's it for Africa Update this week. I've been your host, Chiamaka Nwafor. For more of our programs, follow us on social media platforms, on our YouTube live stream for news and documentaries. Same time, same place next week. Bye for now.